Good afternoon. The number of unemployed people who are actively looking for jobs has fallen sharply in the country due to the national lockdown to limit the spread of the coronavirus pandemic. As a result, the official unemployment rate, which is the sample of the number of people who are looking for employment, has fallen sharply from 30.1% in the first 3 months of the year to 23.3% currently. That's according to Statistics South Africa. There were 4.2 million people unemployed in the second quarter, compared with 7.1 million unemployed in the first quarter. People who were not looking for work were not classified as unemployed. Now, according to Statistics South Africa, 2.2 million jobs were lost in the second quarter. Let's get some reaction from this now. I'm joined by Old Mutual Chief Economist Johann Els. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News this afternoon. Were those numbers expected?
I think there was so much uncertainty around these numbers, but they seem a bit worse than expected. But as you rightly say, when you're not actively looking for a job, you're not counted as unemployed. But the actual fact of the matter is that given the lockdown, there were such difficulties in surveying the labour force. Stats says they switched from in-person surveying to telephonic surveying, and that the sample were also a lot lower. So the numbers seem horrific, as one would expect, given the horrific GDP numbers we had for the second quarter. But there were lots of issues around these numbers. But to answer your question, we expected significant job losses in the second quarter.
Let's stay with the challenges that the Statistics South Africa has had. If there is a difficulty in collecting data, there's also a difficulty in sharing proper information and not being able to give a proper picture of what's happening on the ground, which then impacts how service delivery takes place and what needs to be prioritized. What ramifications does that have?
Yes, that's always very difficult. It's the same with all surveys of people, household surveys, etc. So, as you say, very difficult to get a firm picture of what's happening in the economy at the moment. And I think what best we can do is to look at the average of these numbers over the next couple of quarters. Then we will get a clearer picture of what's happening. Mm-hmm. But I suspect that these numbers can get worse over the last half of 2020, as some of the government support in terms of the COVID-19 support packages falls away in terms of benefits for consumers and benefits for employers in terms of easing the constraints of the lockdown. So I think we'll still see significant weak numbers on the economy and on the employment situation over the next few quarters.
I'm glad you've brought up the fact that we need to look at the next few quarters in order to get a proper picture, because what often happens is these figures come out, there's a collective gasping, and then people just move on. So can you give us a wider overview of how unemployment, especially cyclical unemployment, leads to more unemployment and the ramifications for jobs then?
Yes, we've always had the difficulty in South Africa of actually the measurement around employment, whereas our statistics around the size of the economy and growth in the economy and inflation are excellent. The employment numbers have always been difficult. Having said that, when people are out of a job, they haven't got an income, and there's a big multiplier effect in terms of the whole economy. So you need the economy to grow to generate jobs, but you also need jobs to help the economy in terms of tax payments, in terms of generating more demand, in terms of generating more production, more economic activity. So it's a whole interlinked economic cycle, which is very difficult to get going if there's no decent confidence in the economy. So we as consumers, we hesitant to spend, even if we've got a job, we hesitant to spend, so we save more. That's bad for production, that's bad for employment, that's bad for demand. So the whole interlinkage in terms of the economic cycle is probably bad for us at this point in time. While the economy is busy recovering, the so-called V-shaped cycle, downward in the lockdown phase and in the upward cycle as the lockdown was eased into the third quarter, we'll see better numbers, but it will take a long time to get back to the levels we had before the COVID crisis.
All right, so speaking of that recovery, the United Nations Development Programme had a study that said that South Africa could only recover economically in 2024. Then are we going to keep on seeing these kind of figures until then?
No, I don't think so. I think what they actually meant is our sustained better growth that will get us back to the pre-crisis levels in terms of production, in terms of the size of the economy, in terms of size of the whole labour force. We are gradually seeing economic growth coming through. The third quarter will be far better compared to the second quarter's slump in economic activity. So gradually we will be growing, getting back to pre-crisis levels of employment, levels of GDP. So it's a gradual, slow recovery, but that brings us to the medium term. Where are we headed in terms of economic growth? We need better economic policies. We need better implementation of those policies to get us to a higher growth path on the medium term. I think we almost need to ignore the COVID impact in terms of 2020 and 2021 GDP growth. If you think back to the 5 years to 2019, South Africa already had just 0.8% average GDP growth per year. So even before this COVID crisis, we had weak growth. So we need better policies to lift that weak growth to a higher growth path. Otherwise, the fiscal situation won't improve.
Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. Johann Els, the Old Mutual chief economist, joining me on the line there. Let's now go to the Braamfontein UI